Karen had always acted like she owned the neighborhood. Every morning, without fail, she parked her massive SUV across my perfectly manicured lawn. She didn't care that it was my property, my space, my rules. Her entitlement was obvious, her arrogance unbearable. I tried warnings, polite notes, even reasoning, but nothing worked. She laughed at every attempt, treating my yard like a personal parking lot. That was the breaking point. I started planning quietly. Every inch of my lawn became part of a plan she could never anticipate. What she thought was just a lawn would soon be unrecognizable. A place of chaos disguised as beauty. A lake, a private lake, right where her tires used to crush the grass. And when it was done, Karen would finally understand the consequences of crossing the wrong homeowner. This was more than revenge. It was a statement. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting golden streaks across the lawn. At first glance, it looked serene, peaceful, normal. But the truth was far from it. My lawn, my carefully tended sanctuary, had become a battlefield. Tire tracks ran deep into the soft earth, crushed the flower beds I had spent weeks planting, and left jagged lines across the grass that refused to heal. Every single day, without fail, Karen's SUV would appear, as if she had a personal key to my property. She parked wherever she wanted, turned my pristine yard into her personal parking lot, and laughed at every polite request I made. Her arrogance was astounding, and the audacity infuriating. I walked across the damage, feeling a mixture of rage and determination coiling inside me like a spring ready to snap. Letters, polite notes, even HOA complaints had done nothing. She either ignored them or flaunted them with smug satisfaction. It was as if she believed the rules didn't apply to her, that the neighborhood was her private kingdom and I was merely a tenant in my own home. The thought alone made my blood boil. But anger alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan, a way to not just punish her, but to assert my control, to reclaim my property in a way she would never anticipate. The idea came slowly, quietly, taking root in my mind as I inspected every inch of the lawn. If she wanted to make a habit of turning my grass into her personal playground, then I would transform it into something completely unrecognizable. Something spectacular. Something that would stop her in her tracks. I began mapping the lawn in secret, measuring every corner, every slope, every dip in the earth. Every area that had been crushed by tires became part of the blueprint. I marked spots for excavation, water sources, and drainage. I drew sketches of a small lake, a private oasis, right where her SUV had been so brazenly parked. My plan wasn't just revenge. It was artistry, a demonstration of patience, strategy, and the consequences of entitlement. But she didn't know I had started documenting every violation, every tire track, every crushed flower. I created a file, a record of each incident. Photos, dates, notes, all evidence of her repeated trespasses. Not that I intended to show her. This was for me, for the satisfaction of knowing that every action she had taken was being meticulously recorded. Every time she stepped onto my lawn, she added another line to her own story of downfall. I contacted contractors secretly under the guise of normal landscaping. Excavators, pumps, and diggers were scheduled for nights when no one would notice. Dirt piles began to accumulate, subtle at first, barely visible to the casual observer. Every movement was calculated, every machine placement deliberate. The first trenches were dug under the cover of darkness, the sound of machinery muffled by the night, as if the lawn itself were holding its breath. And if you think this is extreme, wait till you see what comes next. By midweek, the transformation had begun to take shape. The empty lawn was slowly vanishing, replaced by the beginnings of a sparkling body of water. I visualized the final moment constantly. Karen pulling up in her SUV, expecting the usual familiar turf, only to find herself facing a shimmering lake, reflecting the sun and her own shock. I smiled at the thought. The look on her face would be priceless, and deserved. Every day I checked the progress carefully. Small adjustments were made to the slopes to ensure the water would settle perfectly. Plants and rocks were placed in precise positions to enhance the natural look, making it appear as though this lake had existed for decades. It was art disguised as punishment, beauty as revenge. And she had no idea this was happening right under her nose. Even my neighbors, who had noticed the increased activity, assumed it was a regular landscaping project. No one could imagine the scale or intent behind the work. The secrecy was essential. Karen could not suspect, could not intervene, until it was too late. Every detail, every shovel of dirt, every gallon of water, was a step toward her astonishment. The first day of digging left the lawn torn and uneven, a chaotic mess to any casual observer. But I could see the vision forming, and that vision was worth every bruise, every sore back, every night spent in secrecy. This wasn't just about parking spots anymore. It was about authority, control, and respect. My lawn was my kingdom, and I was about to reclaim it in a way no one could ignore. If you think this is just about a lawn, you haven't seen what comes next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time, because the chaos is only beginning. By the end of the week, small pools of water had formed in the trenches, glinting under the sunlight. The lake was coming to life, and with each new inch of water, my anticipation grew. Every night I walked past the site, visualizing the inevitable moment of confrontation. Karen would finally see what happens when someone is pushed too far, when patience turns into action, when entitlement meets strategy. She thought she could cross me every day with no consequences. She had no idea how wrong she was. By the following week, the lake was nearly complete, with a gentle slope and a small island in the center. The sight was mesmerizing, almost surreal. I imagined her pulling up in her SUV one morning, seeing her tires hovering over a body of water where grass had once been. The shock, the panic, the realization, it would be unforgettable. And as I stood there, surveying the almost complete lake, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was more than revenge. This was a statement. Every tire track she left behind, every crushed flower, every tiny affront had led to this moment. My lawn was no longer hers to exploit, it was mine. Transformed and unforgettable. What happens next will be a lesson she never forgets. The sun rose, casting soft morning light over what had once been a simple lawn. But now, the familiar green expanse had begun its transformation into a miniature lake, subtle at first, but unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. The trenches had filled slightly with water overnight, reflecting the sky in a mirror-like surface that made the property look larger, more mysterious. I walked along the edge, boots sinking into the damp soil, noting how the terrain was taking shape exactly as I had envisioned. Every curve, every dip in the ground, every small mound was intentional, calculated to create the illusion of a naturally formed lake. As I inspected the progress, I thought about Karen. She would arrive soon, as she always did, parking her enormous SUV in the same spot she had claimed as her own. The very thought of her confusion brought a thrill I could barely contain. She had no idea that her routine actions had been quietly preparing her own downfall. Every morning she had crossed that lawn, she had been contributing to a masterpiece of reclamation, my reclamation. The workers I had hired were efficient and discreet. They moved with precision, following my detailed plans to the letter. One by one, the trenches were widened, the edges reinforced, and the water flow adjusted to create gentle ripples across the surface. Small rocks and native plants were strategically placed to create the illusion of a natural lake bank. This wasn't just landscaping. It was a silent statement of power, a way to assert control over a situation that had spiraled out of the daily petty annoyances Karen had inflicted. And just as the sun climbed higher, I couldn't help but smile, knowing she was completely oblivious to the transformation unfolding before her. By mid-morning, the sound of water trickling through temporary channels filled the air. Birds began to settle near the forming lake, drawn to the sudden presence of water where there had been none. Even the wind seemed to cooperate, creating small ripples on the surface that made the lake appear alive. Everything was falling perfectly into place. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, and looked over the progress. The central area, where the SUV would inevitably be forced to confront the water, was nearly complete. A gentle slope led from what used to be the grass into the clear water, and a small island in the middle added a touch of elegance and mischief. This was the area that would deliver the shock, the exact moment when Karen would finally understand the consequences of her entitlement. Even as I worked, I thought about the days leading up to this. How I had been patient, documenting every transgression, planning meticulously while she went about her daily routine. The irony of it all was not lost on me. Her own arrogance had created the perfect setup for her lesson. She believed the lawn belonged to her, but in truth it was my stage, my canvas, and she had been unknowingly contributing to my art. By afternoon, the majority of the lake's foundation was laid. Water filled the channels, plants rooted in the banks, and the shape of the lake was now unmistakable. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, almost tangible, as though the earth itself knew that something monumental was about to happen. The transformation was not just physical. It was psychological. Every step I had taken had been part of a plan to reclaim not just my property, but my dignity. Little did she know, her next visit would be unlike anything she had ever expected. As evening approached, I paused again to survey the scene. The lake now reflected the vibrant hues of the setting sun, its surface glowing like molten gold. I imagined her driving up, tires rolling over the familiar path, ready to park as she always had. The realization of what awaited her would come in a moment, sudden and complete. And I would be there to witness every second, the silent observer of a poetic justice years in the making. By nightfall, the temporary barriers had been removed, water settled, and the lake looked almost entirely natural. I stepped back, satisfied. The foundation was ready, the surprise carefully hidden until the inevitable moment. And I knew one thing for certain. The next day, Karen would face the consequences of every day she had disrespected my space. The air cooled as I finally packed up, leaving the machines for the night. Moonlight shimmered across the water, giving the newly formed lake an ethereal glow. It was as if nature itself was in on the plan, silently approving the reclamation of what was mine. And when she finally arrives, she won't just see a lawn. She'll see the power of patience, planning, and perseverance. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of day that seemed ordinary but carried the weight of inevitability. The lake, now fully formed in my mind and partially complete in reality, awaited its first confrontation. I walked along the edge, noting the gentle curve of the shoreline and the way the water caught the first rays of sunlight, shimmering like a jewel across the expanse of what had once been my lawn. Every detail had been meticulously planned. The slope, the placement of rocks, the subtle island in the center, all designed to create the perfect combination of beauty and shock. As I inspected the site, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Karen arriving. The audacity with which she had continued to park on my lawn had left me no choice but to escalate. Every morning she had crossed that sacred green space had been a daily insult, and each insult had been quietly fueling this plan. The machinery, the trenches, the hours of secret labor had all been in preparation for this moment, a moment that would finally reveal the consequences of unchecked entitlement. And little did she know, the first hint of what awaited her would be a sight that stopped her in her tracks. The birds had begun to settle along the banks, adding a natural serenity to the scene that belied the chaos about to unfold. Trees reflected perfectly in the water, their leaves brushing lightly against the ripples. It was beautiful, too beautiful for what Karen had been, too meticulous for what she had expected. Every inch of this mini lake had been created to be both visually stunning and completely unmissable, a statement in stone and water. Throughout the morning, I moved carefully along the edges, testing the firmness of the banks and the stability of the small island. I visualized her tires rolling toward the lake, the moment she realized the ground beneath her SUV no longer existed as it once had. That realization, the moment of shock, confusion, and ultimate surrender, would be nothing short of cinematic. My patience, planning, and meticulous documentation were about to pay off in a dramatic, undeniable way. I glanced at the distant road, scanning for movement, and then I saw her, unmistakable, her SUV turning onto the familiar path. The timing was perfect. She had no idea how thoroughly I had prepared. Every curve of the water, every plant, every subtle slope had been calculated to maximize the effect. The water sparkled, hiding the depth in a way that would only be revealed when she tried to park. And as she approached, I couldn't help but feel a thrill at the anticipation of her reaction. The ultimate payback for weeks, months, even years of her entitlement. She slowed her SUV as she neared the area she had once claimed without permission. Her eyes scanned the familiar patch of lawn, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed she sensed something was different. But arrogance is a powerful blindfold. She continued forward, tires rolling confidently, unaware that the very earth she expected to support her now betrayed her. The first wheel hit the soft edge of the lake. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by panic. Her SUV teetered slightly, the ground slipping away beneath the tires. For a second, she froze, unsure of what was happening, and that second was all it took. She realized, too late, that her daily trespass had created an irreversible consequence. And just like that, every warning, every polite note, every attempt to reason with her had led to this exact moment. I watched silently, a mix of satisfaction and restrained amusement coursing through me. Karen, who had believed herself untouchable, now faced the reality of her actions. The lake was not just a body of water. It was a monument to planning, patience, and the quiet power of strategy. She would remember this day forever, the moment her arrogance met its match. The surrounding neighborhood remained oblivious. From their perspective, it was just a lawn, just some water, just a property under transformation. They could not know the drama unfolding, the confrontation silently witnessed from the edge of the lake. But for me, the satisfaction was absolute. Each detail, every choice had led to this, the perfect culmination of effort, planning, and justice. As I stepped closer, keeping my distance to avoid detection, I could see her finally exiting the vehicle, eyes wide, mouth slightly agape. She tried to find solid ground, but every step reminded her that she had been wrong, that her repeated disrespect had consequences beyond imagination. She had underestimated me, and now the lake made her mistake painfully obvious. And just when you think the story couldn't get any more intense, the next twist is coming. You won't believe what happens after this. The water lapped gently at the SUV, creating tiny ripples that caught the morning light. The island in the center, once a subtle design choice, now seemed like a fortress in miniature, a symbol of the shift in power. Karen's posture betrayed frustration, disbelief, and the dawning realization that she had finally crossed someone unwilling to be passive. By the afternoon, word of the incident had begun to ripple subtly through the neighborhood. Curious neighbors peered from behind fences, whispering to each other. Some assumed it was an accident, a natural phenomenon. Others began to notice the precision, the intentionality, the unmistakable signs that this had been more than chance. And Karen, still struggling to regain composure, could only watch as the scene she had taken for granted became a permanent, undeniable statement. As I walked along the newly formed lake, inspecting the edges and reflecting on the work, I felt a quiet pride. This wasn't just about a lawn or a parking spot. It was about control, consequence, and reclaiming what had been mine all along. And it was about sending a message that arrogance and entitlement, no matter how persistent, could be met with strategy and patience. She thought she could cross me without repercussions. She had no idea how meticulously I had planned every single inch. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the surface of the lake. The water sparkled like molten gold, reflecting both the sky and the astonishment on Karen's face. Every wave, every ripple, every carefully placed rock contributed to the silent, dramatic poetry of this moment. The lawn was no longer hers to exploit. It belonged to strategy, patience, and the relentless power of planning. And as I finally left for the night, the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore was a reminder. The stage was set, the lesson delivered, and the story far from over. The morning light struck differently now, glinting off the lake's surface and highlighting the transformation of what had once been a mundane lawn. The water shimmered in golden hues, perfectly still in some places and rippling in others, catching the attention of anyone passing by. To the casual observer, it was beautiful, almost serene. But the lake carried with it a story of justice, of patience rewarded, and of the consequences of entitlement unchecked. Every inch of water, every planted rock, every tiny island in the center was a testament to meticulous planning. And for Karen, it would become the scene of ultimate reckoning. I arrived early, inspecting the lake from every angle. The edges were reinforced, the slopes smooth, and the water deep enough to create real hesitation in anyone daring to cross. Each detail had been crafted with precision, a blend of beauty and psychological impact. I could already imagine her arrival. The SUV, the expectation, and the sudden shock of realizing that the familiar lawn no longer existed as she remembered it. And just when you think she might find a way out, the lake had been designed to make her pause, to make her think twice. The neighborhood had begun murmuring in quiet tones. Neighbors peeked from behind fences, curious about the new addition to the property. Some assumed it was a whimsical landscaping project. Others thought it an ambitious artistic endeavor. But none suspected the drama that had led to this point. None realized that every element was calculated. Every inch of dirt and water a silent message to one woman who had overstepped her bounds for far too long. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because the best part of the story is about to unfold. By late morning, the faint hum of an approaching vehicle reached my ears. My pulse quickened. Karen's SUV appeared, rolling confidently down the familiar driveway, unaware that the familiar parking spot was no longer there. Her tires crunched on the path, approaching the edge of the lake, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. But arrogance has a stubborn way of delaying recognition, and she continued forward, certain that her routine would remain uninterrupted. The moment her front tires reached the edge of the water, hesitation turned to panic. The ground gave way under her, the suspension creaking under the sudden shift. She braked, but it was too late. The SUV tilted slightly, its tires now partially submerged, the water reflecting her shock back at her. The effect was immediate, dramatic, and deeply satisfying. I watched silently, feeling the culmination of weeks of planning finally manifest before my eyes. And just like that, every warning, every note, every polite attempt to reclaim my lawn had led to this moment of undeniable consequence. Karen's face twisted with disbelief and fury. She scrambled out of the vehicle, her boots sinking into the soft mud at the water's edge. She looked around desperately, searching for some way to regain control, some escape from the predicament she had ignored for months. But there was none. The lake had become both a literal and metaphorical barrier, a reminder that entitlement without consequence only works until the person crossed finally decides to act. The ripples across the water's surface reflected the shifting power dynamic perfectly. What had once been a simple green space for grass and flowers was now a shimmering symbol of authority and strategy. Every plant, every rock, every inch of slope served as a subtle reinforcement of the lesson Karen was learning. Arrogance has limits and boundaries. When crossed, demand accountability. I could hear whispers from the neighbors, who had gathered quietly at safe distances. They murmured in astonishment, trying to comprehend the scale and precision of the project. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads in disbelief. The visual impact was undeniable. The lake was beautiful, unexpected, and completely unmissable. Karen, still struggling to regain composure, became the centerpiece of the scene, a living testament to the cost of repeated entitlement. And as she finally processed the full impact, I felt the satisfaction of weeks of planning and preparation finally paying off. Hours passed and Karen remained by the lake, her SUV partially submerged, her expression a mix of frustration, shock, and the dawning understanding that she had underestimated the situation. I stayed hidden, observing every movement, appreciating the poetic justice unfolding in front of me. The water shimmered, reflecting the late afternoon sun, the sky, and the astonishment on her face. It was a visual drama that could rival any cinematic scene, yet it had unfolded quietly, meticulously on my own property. By evening, the lake had settled completely, the water calm and reflective. Karen's SUV had become a permanent feature at the water's edge, a warning to anyone else who might think they could cross the boundaries I had established. The transformation of the lawn was total, and the lesson irreversible. She had been warned repeatedly, yet she had persisted. Now, the consequences were undeniable, visible for the entire neighborhood to witness. And as I finally stepped back, surveying the lake from a distance, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The water sparkled under the setting sun, reflecting the sky, the trees, and the triumph of planning and patience. This was more than a lawn or a parking spot. It was strategy, it was justice, and it was an unforgettable spectacle. The next chapter will show how Karen reacts once she finally realizes she cannot undo what has been done. And trust me, it's going to get even more intense. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and water from the lake I had painstakingly built. What had once been a simple lawn had been transformed into a shimmering body of water, reflecting the sky and the consequences of repeated entitlement. The sunlight danced across the surface, highlighting every ripple and subtle wave. The sight was mesmerizing, almost surreal, and yet at its heart lay the chaos of confrontation. Karen had yet to move her SUV. It rested precariously at the edge of the lake, tires partially submerged, an unwilling monument to her arrogance. From the corner of the property, I could see her pacing, hands on her hips, eyes scanning the water as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. Every step she took seemed to sink further into the mud, grounding her in the reality she had refused to acknowledge for months. Neighbors had begun noticing, their whispers growing louder, curiosity turning to astonishment. Some hid behind fences, peering cautiously. Others stopped their morning routines, drawn by the unexpected spectacle. What had been a quiet neighborhood now hummed with tension. I stayed hidden, observing, taking in the scene. It was the perfect culmination of my patient planning, a public display of consequences without a word spoken. Karen finally exited the SUV completely, standing at the water's edge, surveying the lake. Her expression shifted rapidly. Shock, disbelief, frustration. She stomped her feet, but the ground gave way slightly under her boots. The lake had been designed with precision, ensuring that any attempt to approach the SUV or reclaim ground would remind her of the irreversible transformation. Every inch she moved reinforced the power of strategy over mere entitlement. The landscape around the lake had been carefully crafted to enhance the psychological impact. Rocks, plants, and subtle slopes created the illusion of a natural oasis, hiding the depth and curvature beneath the surface. Every step Karen took along the edge was a slow realization that she was no longer in control. My careful planning, my patience, and my documentation of every prior offense had all converged into this moment of undeniable consequence. As the day wore on, Karen attempted to rally her composure, pacing around the perimeter of the lake, muttering to herself, her frustration mounting. The neighbors watched silently, many recording videos on their phones. The lake had become the talk of the community, a visual demonstration of one person's audacity and another's quiet determination. The scene was cinematic, almost like a suspenseful drama unfolding in real time. And just when you think she might find a way to recover, every move she makes only deepens the impact of the consequences she ignored for so long. Despite her attempts to regain control, the lake had effectively become an impenetrable boundary. The SUV, stuck and half-submerged, symbolized the futility of entitlement unchecked. Every glance Karen gave it reminded her of the months of disrespect she had shown, the countless warnings she had ignored, and the patience that had allowed me to orchestrate this situation flawlessly. I stayed at a safe distance, taking careful notes of her movements. Each gesture, each misstep, each expression of disbelief was part of the story unfolding. The lake had not just reclaimed the lawn. It had reclaimed authority, respect, and control. It had transformed a petty neighborhood grievance into a lesson she would never forget. By late afternoon, Karen's energy had shifted from anger to desperation. She realized the lake wasn't going anywhere, and that her SUV had become a permanent fixture at the water's edge. She attempted to phone someone, perhaps the HOA, perhaps a towing company, but even the neighbors knew her desperation was now part of the spectacle. Her attempts to reverse the situation only highlighted the meticulous planning that had gone into every inch of this transformation. And as her frustration grew, it became clear that patience and strategy often outweigh raw audacity. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the lake, turning the water a deep, reflective blue. Karen's silhouette, frustrated and bewildered, was framed against the sparkling surface. From a distance, it almost looked like a painting, but the story beneath the surface was real, raw, and uncompromising. Every moment she spent here reinforced the lesson. Entitlement has limits, and patience has power. As night fell, the lake settled into silence. Karen's SUV remained half-submerged, a permanent reminder of her mistakes. The neighbors dispersed slowly, whispers fading into the evening air. The lake glimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the stars above, a tranquil counterpoint to the chaos that had just unfolded. It was a final, quiet assertion of control, the perfect payoff to weeks of planning, patience, and strategic retaliation. And though the confrontation had reached its peak, I knew the story was not over. Karen would adapt, neighbors would talk, and the ripple effects of this event would continue long after the sun had set. But for now, I allowed myself a moment to savor the victory. The lawn had been reclaimed, the lesson delivered, and the lake stood as a symbol of what happens when audacity meets strategy. Dawn broke over the transformed lawn, casting golden light across the mini lake. The water shimmered, catching the first rays of sunlight, reflecting the stillness of a property reclaimed. The lake, once a simple idea born of frustration, had now become a testament to patience, strategy, and quiet power. Every inch of water, every carefully placed rock, and every slope leading into the center had played its role in delivering a lesson Karen would never forget. I arrived early, surveying the scene with satisfaction. The neighbors had started to peek through fences, some whispering, others capturing the spectacle on their phones. The SUV remained half-submerged, a monument to entitlement meeting consequence. Karen's absence this morning suggested she had spent the night strategizing, perhaps calling for help, perhaps trying to figure out how to undo the transformation. But there was no reversing it. This lake was not just water. It was a statement of authority, a reclaiming of control. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the conclusion of this story is something you cannot miss. The morning air was filled with tension. Karen finally arrived, hesitantly approaching the lake, her steps slow, each movement betraying a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. Her SUV, now fully part of the scenery, reflected the sunlight like a stubborn reminder of her miscalculations. The moment she realized the permanence of the lake, the full impact of my planning finally hit her. Every misstep she had made in claiming my lawn now culminated in a lesson she couldn't escape. The neighbors gathered quietly, watching the confrontation unfold. Some whispered about the audacity of turning a lawn into a lake, others about the inevitability of consequences for those who believed rules didn't apply to them. Karen's frustration grew with every passing minute. She paced, shouted, and gestured wildly, but the lake remained, calm and impenetrable. It was as if nature itself had sided with the planning, reinforcing the boundaries she had crossed. I stepped forward, maintaining a calm distance, allowing her to absorb the reality of the situation. The lake sparkled, the water rippled gently, and the air was thick with the poetic justice of it all. Karen's SUV, still stuck at the edge, had become a permanent monument to audacity meeting strategy. Every inch of water, every slope, every plant had been deliberately placed to maximize both beauty and consequence. By midday, Karen attempted to rally, calling neighbors and even threatening to involve authorities. But the spectacle of the lake, combined with the careful planning I had executed, left her powerless. The lake had created a new reality. The lawn was no longer hers to claim, the SUV was permanently affected, and the lesson was irrevocable. Even the HOA, once a looming presence, now seemed irrelevant in the face of a private victory orchestrated with precision. The sun climbed higher, and the lake sparkled under its rays. Karen's futile attempts at reversal only highlighted the meticulous preparation that had gone into every inch of the project. This was not just revenge. It was a statement of patience, foresight, and strategy. The water reflected the sky, the trees, and her astonishment, perfectly capturing the psychological shift of power. As evening approached, Karen finally conceded, retreating from the lake. Her expression was one of exhaustion and realization, the full weight of the lesson finally settling on her shoulders. She had been warned, she had been documented, and now the transformation of the lawn into a lake left her with no options. The quiet triumph of the morning and afternoon had reached its peak, and I finally allowed myself a moment to savor it. The lake, shimmering under the setting sun, had become more than just a body of water. It was a monument to patience, planning, and perseverance. The neighbors gradually dispersed, carrying with them stories of what had occurred, spreading word of the audacity, the planning, and the ultimate lesson Karen had learned. This story would linger in the neighborhood long after the water had settled. And as I stepped back, taking in the full view of my property reclaimed, I felt the satisfaction of completion. The SUV remained at the edge, the lake sparkled like glass, and the lesson was permanent. The property was mine, the lawn untouched by arrogance, and the neighborhood reminded that entitlement meets consequence. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. You've just witnessed the full story, but there are more HOA nightmares coming, and you won't want to miss them. Night fell, and the lake glimmered under the moonlight, peaceful and calm. Karen's failed attempts, the astonished neighbors, and the permanent presence of the water created a story that would be remembered for years. This was the final chapter, the climax, the resolution, the ultimate payback. And in the quiet, I allowed myself a final glance at the masterpiece I had created. Every inch, every ripple, every slope had delivered justice in the most elegant and unforgettable way possible.